Hello magical beings, welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Sarah and I am the Woodland Witch. So in my most recent poll for YouTube, you all voted to see my folk magic book recommendations. So today I have 5 folk magic books that I want to recommend and share with you. Now the reason I've chosen these 5 books is because I feel that they are beginner friendly. They're a little more universal and inclusive. They're not geared toward one specific group of people or one specific location, which is something that you want to consider when looking into folk magic and folk practices. If you're wanting to study a specific type of folk magic, such as English folk magic or Scottish folk magic, location and region is going to play a big part in that. But these books that I've chosen are either geared towards a variety of locations and practices, as well as tools, herbs, and folk healing. Just because I'm sharing these 5 books, that does not mean that there are not other incredible folk magic books out there. I have so many on my shelf and I haven't been able to read through them all yet. So I'm going to share the ones with you that I have fully read and the ones that aren't necessarily specific to the type of folk magic that I practice personally. Most of my practice is centered around Irish and Scottish folk magic with a little bit of English in there. So a lot of the books that I do have are specific to those locations and regions. But these 5 books are books that really helped me when I got started in my folk magic practice, and I hope that they do the same for you. So the first book I'm going to talk about is Wild Magic: Celtic Folk Traditions for the Solitary Practitioner. The reason I chose this book is because it was the very first book that I ever read on folk traditions and folk magic. Celtic is a very broad term. It speaks to a lot of different regions, a lot of different languages, and the reason I liked it so much was because it's so nature-based. My practice is heavily rooted in animism and a belief that all things have a spirit essence to them. It holds folk traditions from Ireland, Scotland, the Isle of Man. There's also some folk traditions from Wales in here. So I think it's very broad and inclusive of a lot of different regions. Because it is so nature-based, it does share how to connect with all of the elements in your practice. One of my favorite things about this book was that it spoke on cloud divination. And cloud divination is something I have incorporated into my practice since the start. And it was really cool to come across folk traditions that incorporate this practice and incorporate something that I have done for such a long time. A lot of lore in here and folk tales that these traditions are based off of. And as we know, folk magic is heavily rooted in folklore and combined with a little bit of practicality. So I really like this one. I love that it incorporates the elements and it's so nature-based. And it does speak a lot about bioregionalism in here, which is so important in a folk magic and a witchcraft practice. Depending on your location, things are going to show up for you differently. Seasons, plants, what grows naturally in your area. So I think it's really important to include that, and I love that this book did. Our next book is going to be Folk Witchcraft by Roger J. Horne. Roger J. Horne has a ton of folk magic books. There is another book that I have called The Art of Incantation, and I will talk about that in my incantation writing video, but I highly recommend any of Roger's books. I found a lot of similarities with this book and The Crooked Path, which I did read first. The Crooked Path is a book on traditional witchcraft. There's been some debate on traditional witchcraft and what exactly that entails and what it means. From my understanding, traditional witchcraft has been used to describe the old ways of doing things, the ways of our ancestors, and the old ones. But more modernly, it has been used to describe other practices that were completely separated and differentiate from Wicca. You have the teachings of Robert Cochrane, the fairy tradition. I will say I think traditional witchcraft, as we know it now, is a little bit more ceremonial at times. Traditional folk practices aren't necessarily always like that. Traditional witchcraft, as we know it modernly, also includes worship of the Horned One and the Queen of Elfame or the Earth Mother. Folk practices don't necessarily have to include the worship of any deities or any spirits. It really just depends on what folk practices that you're working with, the culture that you're working within, and whether or not you believe in that sort of thing. So I do think that this book does a really good job of speaking on the evolution of traditional witchcraft, traditional practices, and folk magic as we know it today. So it does a really good job of taking those old ways of doing things and making it more adapted to a present day practice. The next book we're going to talk about is Folk Magic and Healing: An Unusual History of Everyday Plants. So in folk magic, there are a lot of different branches. Folk herbalism is very often incorporated into folk magic practices. And because a lot of our folk traditions are rooted in folklore, a lot of the herbs that we utilize also have their own history and stories. They all have their own magical associations, and this book goes into all of that. It shares different remedies in here and why they were utilized, as well as the folklore behind them. For instance, you have 4 Thieves Vinegar. There was a group of thieves who banded together to steal from those who had fallen ill. When they were finally captured and asked how they avoided getting sick, They claimed it was from a concoction known as Four Thieves vinegar. I love that this book goes into those remedies and gives us a little bit of history on some of the things that we utilize in our folk herbal practices today. As I said, there are a ton of herbs and plants in here. It goes into their folklore, their history of use, their magical and medicinal properties. So this one's really great if you're looking into herb lore and traditional herbal remedies. I'm going to do this one next because it also kind of coincides with the folk magic and healing, and that is Wild Witchcraft by Rebecca Beyer. I'm obsessed with this book. It's written so well. It's so inclusive. A ton of herb lore in here, as well as remedies and recipes. It's very practical knowledge that I think anyone who's starting out could benefit from. It also teaches you how to be sustainable in your practice and to craft your own tools and your own items. I love that this book goes strictly into just folk herbalism and not necessarily folk magic as a whole, but I think folk herbalism plays such a huge role in folk magic as a whole. I like that it kind of got its own spotlight here, and I think it's a really good read for anyone who's just starting out or even if you're more experienced. This book also speaks to bioregionalism, and as I've stated before, that's super, super important in any sort of practice that you're utilizing. And while folk practitioners and witches were seen as very different back in the day, I think more now than ever we are seeing practitioners combine the two, and I think that this book does a really good job of that. The final book I'm going to talk about is New World Witchery by Corey Thomas Hutcherson. If you can only get one book on any folk magic practices, I would recommend getting this one. This book covers a wide variety of folk traditions and folk practices, which is why I really like it and highly recommend it, especially if you're just getting started. Because folk magic and folk traditions are based so heavily on specific cultures and specific regions, I think it's really important to be knowledgeable about what practices that you are incorporating into your practice. Obviously, we don't want to be adopting something that doesn't belong to us from a culture that doesn't belong to us. So I really like that this book is inclusive about all of that. It's very transparent about where certain practices and certain things come from. There's different tools, rituals, rites, charms, stories, and beliefs, just a compendium of knowledge. So if you're just getting started, I think that this is a really great one. It also includes recommended reading. So if there is a specific thing that you're learning about or reading about in here, it does give you options to extend that knowledge further. And I think that's a really useful source that we can utilize now. Some folk practices and traditions, it's very difficult to find extensive information on. So I love that this book included further sources for you to expand your knowledge even further. All right, everyone, that is 5 folk magic books that I would recommend to you. As I said, I'm probably going to be adding to this later as I make my way through this bookshelf. A few things to consider when you are choosing books on folk magic are going to be location. Region plays such a huge role in folk magic and folk traditions. For instance, I have books on folklore in Highland Scotland and Lowland Scotland because they are different. Even though Ireland and England are in close proximity, all of their traditions are going to vary in some way as well. So be very specific about the location. And also look into anthropological texts as well. Folk magic and tradition is a way of the people. It is targeting practical ailments and things that were commonly dealt with at a specific time. So look into the anthropological texts as well. What were these people doing? How were these people living? That's going to give you a lot of insight to specific traditions and beliefs from a certain area. As always, thank you so much for being here, and I will see you in the next one.